Smita, we can start.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Um, Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I am Sumita Singhal, working as a program manager in Center for Science and Environment. Today we are going to talk about the much important topic, which is on understanding the septage desludging models, what works and what does not work. So before going further for the webinar, I would take you through the housekeeping rules. Please be aware about your audio and video settings. Ask session related queries either in the question and answer section, else you can ask this question in the question and answer session, which we have kept separately. Raise your hand if you want to ask something, or in case if you want to share something. Mute yourself while not talking. Now I will take you through a summary of the registrations, what we have received. Let me share with you that we have received an overwhelming response in terms of registrations for this webinar. We have received a total of 700 registrations so far from 35 countries. Maximum registrations are from USA, from India, followed by USA, Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia, South Africa, etc. More than 200 cities have been registered in this webinar, out of which 150 cities are from India. We have 30% registrations from female and rest are from males. So one more important thing which I will like to tell you, in any case, if any power failure happens or any breakdown happens, then my colleagues will take it over as a co-host. So now, without wasting much time, I would like to call upon or request my academic director, Dr. Suresh Kumar Rohilla, to take it further as a moderator for the session. It's over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sumita. Very good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all who are connecting from different parts of the world. My name is Suresh Rohilla. I am the Senior Director at the Water, and I direct the Water Program at Center for Science and Environment. We are a global policy think tank, and we have a knowledge and capacity building initiative called School of Water and Waste. And in my capacity of academic director, we do time to time organize webinars on important areas of interest. And last couple of years, we have been watching the space of how across the global south, different players working in the water and sanitation sector have been able to bring the focus of global south cities and human settlements from sewerage to sanitation. And one important area of work which has happened and the investments have gone into is basically the uh, prioritization of funding for effective fecal sludge management. Fecal sludge management, one of the areas which has picked up is that creating of hardware, which is similar to which happens in the area of sewerage, like having STPs or conveyance systems. So there has been a great achievements in terms of providing FSTPs in terms of numbers, like 450 fecal sludge treatment plants are coming up in India. However, across India, 2 years ago, 2019, we have been declared open defecation free. And many countries in Asia and Africa are looking forward towards India in terms of good practices, what works and what doesn't work. And we look forward to international champions who we have put together today as speakers, key speakers, who can tell us that, how they have navigated through this, areas of interventions across the sanitation value chain, as well as some of the Indian champions who have navigated these waters and made some progress on basically how not only just the treatment, which is the end in the one of the, you can say, second last or the last steps in the FSM sanitation chain, but we need to put focus on across the value chain interventions. I think we are very excited. I am very excited. I welcome all the speakers, international and national, whose work CSC follows. And I personally am interested and looking forward to listening to all. Without without taking much more time to, talk about CSC much and School of Water and Waste, I would invite my first round of panelists we will start with the international panelists. But Sumita, can you put the agenda on the screen?
Yes.
So the agenda for today's 2-hour slot is that we will begin with international experience on desludging of septage, as well as which is also popularly called fecal sludge in different spheres. So we would start with 3 presentations, 15 minutes each. You are requested to put in your questions if you have before. So I will take questions after the end of these 3 presentations. If you have questions before that, you can put it in writing, and the respective speaker can answer and take questions from there and answer it in the question answer part also. Then we will move on to the remaining 3 Indian experiences of desludging case studies, good practices. So, and again, we will have, we'll open up the house for, questions and answer session for another 10-15 minutes. This is the broad spread, and I would try to close the session in 2 hours from now. So, looking forward to the first speaker. Can you, Dorai Narayan. So I have with me today the first contributor to this webinar, Mr. Dorai Narayana, who is an internationally renowned consultant in the space of fecal sludge management, and he has contributed extensively in Malaysia and also has been supporting in India, South Asia, and Africa with his rich experience. And he has recently co-authored a book on co-treatment of septage and fecal sludge published by IWA. And his main areas of expertise include policy, strategy formulation, catchment planning, sewage and sludge treatment facilities, and mainstreaming of fecal sludge management. So Dorai, to you, 15 minutes, and I look forward to your presentation. And I think your presentation will be, you will be assisted by Sumita from Center for Science and Environment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Suresh. Could we have the slides?
Yes, sir.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I see a lot of friends here from all over the world who I've met in many occasions. So it's good to meet you again online here. I'll be talking about this desludging particularly, but also broadly on site systems in the context of what we have gone through in Malaysia for the past 50 years or so. Next slide, please. So in the beginnings, what we started off was, of course, very poor sanitation, OD and direct discharges, things like bucket latrines, polluted rivers, and things like that. And at that time, the municipalities were managing this, and the help that they got from the central government was basically to prepare master plans. So the central government assisted them to prepare master plans for their city. And most of the time, these master plans, they sat on the shelf of the local bodies, Next, please. So the reason for that is that the master plans focus on sewage systems. So this was considered the gold standard following Western countries. And they envisaged that all cities would have 100% of the city covered by sewerage, and everyone would be connected and taken far away to a place to be treated and so on. So this was the concept that was followed in the master plans because that was the gold standard at that time. But what happened was that these things are so expensive and so difficult to implement that hardly 1 or 2 of the municipalities made any start. And even they, like Kuala Lumpur, for example, which is the capital of the country, they managed to cover maybe 30 to 40% of the city. And the rest of it remained with other kinds of systems. And all the other local bodies in the rest of the country, they could not even make a start on this because it was so difficult and expensive. Next, please. So what did they do? They had this sanitation improvement program. Next slide. Yeah, so the municipal urban sanitation program, they said, okay, we will now convert what we have to something minimum. That is a septic tank, if possible, or improved pit. So all the local bodies, they came up with their own programs, and with some awareness programs and some kind of a revolving fund to help people and incentives and so on. And they managed to improve that. And they managed to get everyone to use at least a septic tank or a pit. Now, next please. So what happened today, of course, this is today's figures. We find that the centralized systems are covering about 35% of the population, the urban population of the country, and decentralized sewage systems about 35. That's about 70, pretty high compared to many Asian countries. And the septic tanks are only a small percentage. But this was not the case initially. Initially, the septic tank and the others, so-called pits and so on, constituted a big thing. But what the main point was that the sewer systems that were constructed were not being operated well. And they were really falling into disrepair, and they were just bypassing the sewage directly to the rivers. And the septic tanks were not being emptied regularly. They only were emptied on demand basis. And the sludge that was emptied was also just discharged into the nearest drain or river or land somewhere. So that was what was happening. And this was a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. And by the early 1990s, the government already decided that something had to be done on this. Next, please. So here in 1994, the government decided that if they left it to the local bodies, this will never get done. And they wanted something quick. And so what they did was, there was a governance change. And this entire sector, the sanitation sector, was brought under the central government. And there was a Ministry of Water, and there was a regulator under the Water Ministry. And at the same time, they created a private company called Inda Water, which is shown there. And they had to manage all these sewerage systems which were out there, refurbish them and get them working and run them effectively. But more important to us today is that Inda Water was also required to provide septic tank services. So what effectively this happened was, from the local to the central governance, the uniformity of policy, regulation, and institutional arrangements was a huge plus point. And there was a co-management of septage and sewerage by the same entity, by the same regulator, by the same ministry. All these became plus points. And secondly, Inda Water was at that time a private company. And this private sector infused a lot of new innovative practices. And they also created permit holders, which were individual or companies owning tankers, which carried out desludging services. So the private sector came in, and there was a lot of efficiencies introduced due to that. Next, please. So 1994 shift, what the government intended was, the local authorities were doing demand emptying of septic tanks and pits only when people called for it. And the payment was made on service. So before the emptying is done, the people have to pay. And effectively, there was no treatment of the sludge that was emptied. They were just dumped anywhere convenient. And what the government intended through this concession to Inda Water, which was a utility company on a nationwide basis, was that there would be 100% schedule emptying on a 2-year interval. This was included in the concession agreement with that company. And a monthly tariff would be charged on all septic tank premises, and all sludge removed would have to be treated. Now, this was included in the concession agreement, and the company had to do it. Next, please. But this was not so easy to do. The huge issues were encountered on day one. There was no database. No one knew where the premises using septic tanks were, and let alone, they just had no list also, let alone a map or something which shows where they are located. Tankers which were used by the municipalities were basically junk. They just could not be used. They were all really broken down. And there were no treatment facility other than 1 or 2 bigger cities. They had a few sludge treatment facilities. Other than that, nothing. And also because the people on the ground had not been prepared for this. So there was a huge refusal. You know, people were saying that I've never emptied my tank for life. You know, I can't recall when I've done it last, and I've not encountered any problem. Why should I do it now? And on top of that, I have to pay for it. You know, so the ground had not been prepared. So, and the outreach to the people had not been done, and all this caused a huge problem in this program. Next, please. And the success rate at the end, that was after maybe 7 to 8 years of Inda Water's efforts at programs and campaigns, only hit 30%. That was the success rate that was hit. In other words, what was targeted was 100% schedule emptying, but the success rate was only 30%. Right? Next, please. So this was the story. From a demand, it went to scheduled into 1994 until 2008. And the government then made another shift, which was another blunder. Next, please. So here in 2008, they introduced some new procedures where they called it liberalization. And they said, oh, we will not have a monopoly by this in the water. And the owner of any house may call any permit holder licensed by the regulator who has a tanker to come and empty his house. And the charges would be one-off charges. And the sludge, but the sludge must be brought to the utility for treatment, that is to indoor water. So this, when they tried this, immediately the company stopped the scheduling, and from 30%, it dropped to less than 10%. So that was the impact of this move in 2008. The idea why the government did it was the government thought that after nearly 14 years, from 1994 to 2008, that people would have got used to the idea that they have to do schedule emptying, and they would voluntarily do it, because the responsibility of scheduling was taken away from the company, and there was no one doing the scheduling now. People had to schedule their own desludging. Next, please. And now they have realized that this is not working, and they have now come to the new regulation, which has just come into force. And it's pretty much going back to square one, and the utility will schedule, but the actual emptying would be outsourced to permit holders. And the sludge must be brought for treatment, and again back to monthly tariff. This is a new regulation, but it has not been implemented yet. Right now, it's being discussed. Right? Next, please. So in terms of cost recovery, you would find that when you have an emptying scheme that is demand-based, you can have charging on provision of service. Because people want the service, they would pay. But when you have schedule, you cannot do that because people do not want the service. So that would be, if you have payment on provision of service, you would find that your scheduled desludging does not work so well, because people would resist the desludging because they don't want to pay, right? And the tariffs can be either direct or indirect, either direct payment or through taxes or through water rates or some other way. It can be on service or on a continuous basis, which is how we started monthly. And there has to be some kind of a subsidy to begin with, because, next please. This is basically public goods where people don't really see much benefit from the emptying on a scheduled basis, particularly because everything is working in their place, and we have now come in and started to empty the thing. And we need to decouple the charge and the service for more effective service provision. Make it a monthly charge, if possible, hidden in taxes. And we say that this is a free service now, right? And thirdly, if you can do it gradually, do the desludging, show results, and then increase the frequency, for example. And some cross subsidies could be introduced between different sectors, commercial and domestic, for example, or low cost areas and higher income areas. Next, please. Next, please. Oh, you're not moving the slide. Please move the slide. Yeah, okay. So another improvement that took place was treatment facilities were built all over the country and within short distance of all urban areas. So within a 25-kilometer radius of every urban area, we had a treatment facility. Next, please. And in terms of, next, please. Yeah. And treatment technologies started off with, before this. Started off with very simple and basic things like trenching, and then went on to drying beds, Joe bags. So this was an incremental introduction of technologies. Now trenching has been phased out, but most of the others are remaining depending on the locality, the volume that is being handled, and so on. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So on the, it is necessary also to consider the containment. So in Malaysia, we have got a system where every septic tank installation must be approved, and guidelines for this, and the person submitting it, the person constructing, and the product itself must be approved by the regulator. So, and mostly they are using prefabricated septic tanks like this one, right? And this has resulted in very good quality of infrastructure. Next, please. Next slide, yeah. And this, of course, the procedures for how to do the thing, the fees, the methodology and SOP, the safety and the maintenance of equipment, tankers, keeping records, all these has become very well established in Malaysia, so much so that it has become inculcated as culture to the workers and the contractors as well. Next, please. This is a system that has been implemented where not only a GPS in the vehicle, but the GPS also detects when the tanker starts pumping, where the pump is actuated either to suck or to discharge. And from these, a lot of analysis can be done of what kind of efficiency is being achieved, how long it's taking, and what is the route efficiency, and so on. And also abuse and illegal discharges can be detected from the system, because you know the coordinates and when the tankers are pumping in, when they are discharging. Next, please. So if you look at this is basically a SFD or shit flow diagram. Many of you will be familiar. This is how it looked like in the 1960s. And you notice that a lot of the red arrows are terminating in the immediate environment of people, because at that time the local bodies were taking care of on-site systems. And next, please. And by the sanitation improvements, huge improvements took place, and the red arrows which are discharging waste and pollutants in the immediate neighborhoods, they have got reduced. Next, please. And now today we have very good. This is this, and we still have a little bit which will then be addressed. Next, please. And over the next period of time, when we get the schedule emptying done, you find the improvement will still take place. Why is the improvement not so great? The thing is because we don't use groundwater that much. So as long as the septic tank is there and soaking into the ground, that is considered in a way safe to some extent. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what worked? The governance stage, where you had a champion, you had a central government coming up with unified regulation and institutional arrangements. Yes, that was a plus point. The private sector involvement, they bring in efficiencies, they bring in competition, they bring in innovation. Incremental introduction of technologies, yes, that is another plus point that worked in our case. Stakeholder engagement was not done initially, but subsequently a lot of campaigns were carried out by Indowater as well as by the government. And all this resulted in very good improvement of the desludging success rates. The quality of the containments must be ensured for new ones and for what is already existing. And of course, the SOPs and procedures, these things work very well. And these are things which can be plus points for Malaysia. Next. And what did not work? Next, please. The Big Bang approach. This is what they tried. And a lot of cities are trying this Big Bang approach. On day one, we would go for full schedule emptying of every area in the city. Now, that just doesn't work. I would suggest a more step-by-step approach, where from the demand, you could go to once in 5 years, for example, and then to 1 to 4 years and 3 years and 2 years and so on. This will also help us to create the awareness. At the same time, the capacity of the treatment and the emptying could also be built up gradually, and the capacity of people who are running this thing could also be built up. The lack of awareness before the start of the whole program, again, a big thing that we need to look at, that before you start anything, the awareness program must be built up. The charging schemes must be, again, gradual, and if possible, it is not direct. If possible, it is hidden in taxes, in the water rates, and coupled with the awareness program, slowly we could have a more direct method of charging. And the institutional inequity, this is one point that we have, in the sense that the private company of Indowater was required to get the desludging done, whereas it had no power to force people to accept the desludging. So in this case, they had no power. So the people who had the power were the regulators and the government. They should have been enforcing this and helping the company to achieve the desludging targets. And
if
I
you
think
can
that's
summarize it.
Yeah, that's the end of my last slide, Suresh. Thank you so much, and I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Durai, for an interesting presentation. And I'm a great fan of SFD, and I'm very excited to see that, you use the SFDs to communicate, saying that how the transition has happened and how Malaysia has been able to make progress on, effective fecal sludge management and then achieve citywide sanitation, I would say. And all human settlements are reporting substantial progress towards the SDG goals in that case. So very good presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm sure participants have also enjoyed. I do see that several people are posing questions in the chat box. May I request you to put the questions in the Q&A section such that the speaker can take these questions and answer in writing also. But towards the end of the 3 presentations, I will open up the floor for live question answers. Okay. And we will move on to the next presenter. Professor Juliet is the second speaker in the agenda for today's program. She represents University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, and she's a professor there, and she leads the applied research to improve development policy and practice, addressing social justice and sustainable development goals. So she leads Institute's International Development Research Team and supervises several doctoral students focused on innovation in sanitation and water areas. So we are looking forward, Juliet, to your presentation, and if you can summarize in 15 minutes what you have in terms of experience in Global South, on how did you take the scheduled discharging forward.
Great, thank you, Suresh, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'll be speaking on behalf of ourselves at UTS, but also SNB in a joint urban sanitation program that we've been working on together. And my focus is on scheduled desludging, but within the broader context of how to strengthen the overall urban sanitation system in different cities. So first of all, some of the key messages in this presentation. Desludging, it sounds like a simple thing, just empty a tank, but actually there are so many complex decisions that are required, and governments need information, need new tools and support to apply them. And that's really because FSM isn't about a single approach. And in this presentation, you'll hear how rapid data collection processes and pilots have been a way to help local governments learn. And so that learning through doing has been a way to build knowledge and experience, but it only works then if there's a conducive environment to sustain action in the long term. I think we heard then from Durai just how long it took in Malaysia, and that's with a very conducive external environment. So in other places where it's less so, it can be quite difficult. The fourth point, that desludging is just one part of the broader chain. We have to think about it in relation to containment, in relation to treatment. And lastly, so progress was made in the cities in which I'll describe, and various planning tools were used and models developed, but really there was still a long way to go to develop sustainable services. I think looking again at the Malaysia timeframe, we can see that these are not the services you can develop overnight in any city, especially if you're starting from quite a low starting point. So I'll be sharing first some background on 3 scheduled desludging programs that were developed in Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Nepal. 4 of the key strategies that underpin the approach, and then 3 lessons that are important for us in thinking about how to approach this area. And lastly, I'll just point to some of the outstanding areas that we still all need to research and I guess develop better practice about to progress desludging. So first of all, the context of this presentation is really about a focus on local governments, so city governments who in most countries are responsible for fecal sludge management, but their starting point generally is very low. It's not traditionally been part of something that's been a government responsibility. It's been households and perhaps an informal private provider that have dealt with this to now. And so it's a new area in which new skills are needed, and cities need to be equipped. And it's also an entry point to be able to develop skills to handle the whole sanitation chain. So some background on the cities where these programs were developed. 2 cities in Bangladesh, one that was a mid-sized city, Khulna, and also Kushtia, which is a much smaller city. And in those environments, at the time of this work, mostly the emptying that was done was manual emptying. There was just one vacuum truck, and very low percentages of containment systems had ever been emptied. And then similarly in Kalianda, Indonesia, it's a small city in southern Sumatra. Very few containment systems had ever been emptied, and they had just upgraded treatment plants. So they were looking at how to improve services. And lastly, in Virendranagar in Nepal, again, a small city, but one which had a little bit more of a starting point where about a quarter of the systems had been emptied so far. And the systems in these cities generally with pit latrines or septic tanks. And in all places, there was only some informal on-demand emptying at the beginning of the programs. So I'll move on to talk about the strategies that were used in this experiential learning approach. So firstly, rapid data collection, just to understand containment systems, how much sludge are we talking about? And so the approach that was taken was to do just small scale surveys. So 100 households, 300 households, not a huge sample, but what that meant was it was low cost, low resource, and it actually gave you a huge head start in terms of data, local data, to base decisions about a desludging model on. And so I guess my point is that we don't need to think about doing censuses, etc., at the beginning when we're trying to develop these services. We can do just small amounts of data collection to get things started. And in terms of government's involvement, the officers were well involved in the data collection, but it wasn't something that they picked up and then developed further. And I think that's coming back to this conducive environment of there needs to be external motivations for why a city is really going to tackle the issue of desludging long term. The second strategy was about co-developing a program and a model for a city and the option. So Duray explained a little bit about the need for cost recovery, the ways of achieving that, the need, if you're thinking about moving to scheduled desludging, the need to think about tariffs and how those can or should be set, and which sorts of costs need to be recovered. So is it just to recover the costs of running the trucks, etc., or does it need to, for instance, recover the cost of a treatment plant or just the treatment plant operation? And so there are many different parameters in designing a whole system. And the decision support tool that was used was the Septage Management Decision Support Toolkit, developed originally, I think, by David Robbins. And this was an Excel model. You could vary frequency, you could vary tank size, you could vary many different parameters, but it also was constrained in that you had to have a wholly a whole focus just on scheduled desludging. You couldn't have a mixed model, and you had to look at whole cities at a time. So there were some challenges in using, I guess, an existing tool. And one of the things that had to be weighed up at that time is the pros and the cons of on-call, of scheduled, and of block desludging. And in these cities, as I mentioned earlier, the on-call was the status quo. That's how the situation when the program began. And we have a lot of disadvantages of that situation. And I think, again, I say that when they switched back to that, they dropped down to 10%. I think we can't rely on households being motivated to desludge. And so moving to at least block desludging, which is where you take just specific areas of a city to desludge them at a certain time, that can mean that you can at least systematize the process. But what you see in some of the cons of developing either block or scheduled desludging is that you start to need much management and administration. You need databases, you need regulations, you need to have good communication with customers. So you start to have to develop a whole management infrastructure around this scheduled desludging process. And that all takes time, and it takes a lot of negotiation between different government agencies to set it up. So one way to help move that forward is to conduct just small early pilots to see how things could work. And the example on this slide is from Khulna in Bangladesh, where they did just very short few-day trials, let's try some of the logistics of a different service provider providing emptying services, working out where could we put a transfer station to reduce the transport time, what kinds of consumer preferences were there, what was their willingness to pay, and what was the capacity of this, in this case, it was a community-based organisation, what was their capacity to actually manage this system of organised scheduled desludging. And they discovered that there was much more to it than perhaps they had realised. So these kinds of pilots helped to show in concrete terms what the different challenges were that they would need to overcome and to help evolve and develop the model. A last fourth strategy that was used was to really think about the legal landscape. So in each city to understand what regulations are there, what regulations may need to change. If we're going to introduce a new tariff policy, how's that going to be collected? Is it going to be through property tax? Is it going to be through a specific charge? There are so many different possibilities, and working very early on the regulations is a really important strategy. It's something that takes quite a long time to change in most cities. So moving on to the key lessons from the approaches that were taken. The first of those is, again, this emphasis on rapid data collection that can help with preliminary design. And I think I've already mentioned most of the points here, that rapid feedback of hearing what works, what doesn't work. It's good to listen to an international audience or a national audience about what's happened in other places, but really each city is going to have its own learning process. The second point is about involvement in the city government to strengthen their own capacity and systems. If we want to move from just info on call to scheduled desludging, then we need to have a regulatory and monitoring environment around that, and we need to help set up, no matter what type of service provider it is, whether it's a private provider, an NGO, or a government trucks, there's going to need to be systems set up around that. But in a conducive environment where there's political will, where there's city leadership, where there's interest from the private sector, and where there's consumer demand, that's where things are going to be easier and help drive the desludging forward. And the last point, that desludging must be considered as one part of the whole chain. You don't want to set up lots of emptying and then not have anywhere to take it if there's no treatment plant. And equally, you don't want to build a treatment plant if you've got no emptying to help deliver the sludge. And for containment, do we have access to the containment systems? Can you actually open them to empty them? So the whole cycle, sanitation cycle has to be considered together. And a lot of the different institutional roles, etc., need to be considered together, not separately. So lastly, a few areas that we see as still in need of attention. So a lot of the tools for planning, FSM investment and prioritization are kind of siloed into either technical tools or financial tools, or ones that focus on the environment or health. And we need to start to bring them together so that we can satisfy all those objectives of FSM. The second point, in forums such as this, we need to be able to gradually build up the evidence base of what desludging options work in which environments, so that we can make quicker decisions as the practices evolve across different countries. And lastly, we need to solve some of the technical challenges of how to deal with very dense urban areas, how to develop effective transfer stations that can really reduce the transport costs, and more effective containment and treatment options. And so this presentation is based on a learning paper and a learning brief. You're very welcome to have a look at those for further information. And thanks, Suresh. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Juliet. Perfect dot on time. Very good presentation, sharing experience from Nepal and Bangladesh, which have a similar context. But however, the RISE presentation did present context where I would say where the per capita incomes are many-fold higher than India's situation, where we are going to be. Let's also go to the next speaker and see how did Indonesia, address these issues. So I have the next speaker here with me, Budi Darmawan. He is the private sector FSM consultant for Indonesia. And he has a rich experience of over 30 years in the area of wastewater sanitation and marketing. And in the last 18 years, he has dedicated to small and medium enterprise development. So Budi, 15 minutes to you and to learn from Indonesian experience, how did you navigate on the scheduled lease studies?
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I would like to share about this. Sorry, Sita. Can you help me, Sumita?
You want your presentation?
Yes.
Budi.
Sorry.
Sumita, can you screen his presentation? Yeah, no worries.
Yes.
But for the participants, you have a detailed profile of Budi and all other speakers posted here on the right in the chat box. You can have a look at that. And Budi, if you feel till the time my colleague shares the screen, yeah, you can start. And you can just say next, and my colleague will help you with the slides. Okay.
Okay.
Please go ahead. So full screen, can you do it, Sumita?
Yes. Okay. I would like to share about the Jakarta and Surakarta models here, because I just realized that we are very far away from that what Nora said, from Malaysia and also from Philippines. But well, we have to do something right about that. Okay, next. Yes, here are some facts of Indonesia. Indonesia big in size and big in population also. And also Indonesia is consists of 17,000 islands, and it is not in the flat area. So it is much in the contour, and it is makes not easy to have desludging. Actually, we have some national roadmaps and policies, and some of the roadmap and policies we get through progress, good progress, and now we are having some acceleration on that. And yeah, we need to more organize alignment and also in implementation on the ground. And almost all the cities supported by the private sector, usually about 50 to 80% of the private sector doing the desludging on the cities. And I will share you the example of I think 2 cities. The one is the starting one, the Jakarta one, and the advanced is the Surakarta one. Well, in general, we need more integrated effort and activities, and also a new technology approaches. Next, please. Yeah, basically we have 2 big concepts in the water treatment. One of the on-site and another is the off-site system. Well, why we do this? Because at several cities we need the on-site system more than off-site system, and the other way around. Okay, next. Next, please. Yeah. We have some progress of our cities here, but I will not tell you it's one of them because it is too many. And basically, there are 17 provinces below the national standard, and we are getting let's say getting more effort on this 17 province. Okay, we start with the big one, the Jakarta one. Okay, next. Yeah, here are the sewerage projects in Indonesia. as we can see, there's two big projects in Jakarta, but also while we're waiting for the project to finish, which is takes maybe more than 20 years, we start with the desludging, and the local company who run the desludging in Jakarta is a local local government company actually, and this is called the wastewater company of Jakarta. And we start with some lesson learned from FSM3 in India, FSM4 in India, and also we visit some neighboring country like Malaysia and then Philippines. And what we will do in Jakarta is start from the very first, from the very beginning. Okay, next. Yeah, here is the Jakarta Sewerage Development Project. It is quite big, and I think the number is about more than 600 million US. So it is kind of huge, but we cannot waiting for that. We have to do something about that desludging. Next. Yeah, in Jakarta, we do some regulation about the subsidized improved sanitation, and it is consists of about 10,000 household to be subsidized. And next, after that, we will do the survey and data. It is door-to-door survey, and after that we do the construction. But what doesn't work now is about that because of the COVID pandemic, we have to cut the budget very big cut, and it is about from 36,000 to be only 2,000 household to be subsidized. So it is quite a big cut. And second, yeah, because we only do the construction now, we are not yet do the monitoring, and also the regular desludging as the main target. Maybe after the construction and people doing the using that sanitation, we can do the regular desludging. Okay, next. Yeah, this is the regulation, and I think one of former director of the local company owned by the Jakarta government is here, Pak Subakti, and he's the one who pushed this regulation to the governor, and to make the PD Paljaya, the local company, is in charge of the survey, and then of the construction, and also the desludging. This is about 1,000 data first we do on the ground. Next. Okay. Next. Click 1, 2, 3. Yes. So this is the first step that we will construct subsidized sanitation along the river. So Jakarta consists of 13 rivers, and the 3 big rivers are concerned to be monitorized. and the people who live side by side with the rivers are not having the good septic tank, so they are directly discharged from the toilet to the river. So that's why this is the prioritized to make that low income household get the subsidized tank, septic tank from the governor. Next. 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 So after that, we will do the other part of the Jakarta, the east part and the west part. Now we're doing the survey, which is about 10,000, but because of the COVID, we only get 2,000, and we still have to get the number of enumerator and survey increased. And from the very first time, we do the survey by the Android-based application, and the next one we will more have the scheduled stakeholder coordination meeting, because so many layers in Jakarta, so many layers of the government official, we have to coordinate each one of them. Next. Yeah, as you can see here, the enumerators do the surveys by the app, and it is sometimes it's not easy because the household or the situation it is very dense, very what do you call it? Not slum, not too slum, but the road is very. It is not a road actually. It is a pathway, and it is not easy to get people understand why we have to do the improved sanitation. And at this moment, we do the socialization every time before we do the survey, and sometimes it's not enough one time, maybe 2 times or 3 times. We have to do the socialization to the people there. Next.
If you can take 2-3 minutes to just summarize.
Okay. Okay. This is the survey result, and you can see on the right side there's a 1 and 2 area. We will more detail about that. Next. Yeah. So we know exactly which house that get the subsidized, and the next after this we will transfer to the Google Map, and we will have the map for the truck driver when it comes to desludging. Next. Yeah, in the survey we also do the drawings to make more easy when to construct. I mean, where the existing and where the new septic tank want to be placed. Next. Yeah, this a long house, long small house like this. Next. So it is easy to people who construct when it is ready. Next. This is the individual septic tank, and it is certified. It is produced by the PD Paljaya also. I mean, for it is produced by the local company owned by the government. Next. Next. Yeah, this is the delivery. And at number 3, we have the local authorities as also inspect and monitor the delivery, because it is quite, let's say, quite an not expensive, valuable things. So it is much guarded by several people from the local authorities. On the number 4, yeah, sorry. Okay. This is the process of construction. You have to dig the hole, and then the septic tank carried to the house. But sometimes the door, I mean the frame, is not wide enough for the septic tank. So the mason has to do some adjustment to the frame of the door. And after, sorry, back again, sorry. Yes, and the last picture is about that. After they finish, they also replace the tile with the new one. Okay, next.
You summarize it, Goody, if you can just take.
Yes, sorry. Okay. Okay. Can I have more 2 minutes?
Okay, please.
Yes. Okay. In Surakarta is more complete of the works. We do the pilot regulation, private sector, IT base, and then the upsize of the private sector as the result of the good practice there. Next. 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 This is the pilot activity. We choose 2 private sectors there, and there's a activity for the pilot, 20 household trials and detailed virtual costs, and 1 trip for 2 or more household. This is the key, and the one day the truck can get 2 or 3 more trips. Okay, next. Okay, this is the how many institutions involved in the regulation. There's from the mayors, the local government, and also the House of Representatives. Next. Next. Sorry. Yeah. Next. Next. So each time they stop, the driver scan the barcode, the QR code, to make the mark as they start the job, they finish the job, and they next. And they dump to the dumping facility. Next. Next. And they get back to the private sector office. Next. 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 Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is how the private sector works. They find the addresses, they discuss with the household, and then the household, the owner of the household sign the paper who scheduled what time, what date they will discuss. Next. Sometimes there are difficult case, like the septic tank is under the concrete. Next. Or even the septic tank is not reachable because of the situation. Like here, when the desludging done. After the desludging, the driver scan the barcode to mark as they finish the work. Next. Yeah, here paperwork. Next. Yeah, in the facility, the officer from the facility scan the QR code of the truck. So it is closing the loop. I mean, one job is done. Next. Yeah, this is the application. Okay, next. Yeah, and one of the successful story is the person who start as a graduate from the high school on the 2012, and now he own about 3 trucks and still getting more because of this because of the arrangement and what have been done in the Surakarta. Okay, I think that's all. Sorry for taking time.
Thank you, Buddy, for the interesting presentation. And it clearly shows that the piloting is important. One should do start with small target groups. But I do see that, pandemic has impacted the resources. Very interesting presentation. But I would say that, if you really look at post-pandemic, water and sanitation still remain the core areas of, interventions. I think knowing that, this is a growing realization because these are major public health risks. So I think it's very interesting presentation. Now I would open up the floor for questions, and I will pick up the questions from the Q&A section. I would request if there are questions, they should mention the speaker's name to whom the question is, and then also they should indicate their name and the question. Okay, so I will take a question for Buddy. It is from Amritas Hardyanto. As the current knowledge and implementation, many have not been able to distinguish the implementation of wastewater and fecal sludge treatment. Does the separation of domestic wastewater and fecal sludge treatment actually have to be separated? How is this regulation and quality standard effluent reference? Any idea?
Okay. Actually, it depends on the local authorities. In Indonesia, not so many provinces and even the cities are aware about this. Has to how to handle of this. So it is still on progress, but I can assume that it is not in the near ahead. We will have the conclusion on that. I mean, in Indonesia we have still more what you call it, more effort, more synergize of one to another institution in the local authority.
There's another question which I'll take it from Suman Shah to Juliet. Does this co-compost have any official trade license to sell in the local market from Ministry of Agriculture? Would you like to take this, Juliet?
I'm sure, but unfortunately, I'm not sure of the answer. So I would need to take that one on notice. In other work we've done in Sri Lanka, that's been one of the, like a really important step, and also doing a lot of work with people on the bottom, so different farmers of different scales to understand acceptability. But on the specific point for Kushia, I'm not aware, so I'll need to get back on that one.
So as organizers, we would come back to you with the answer. We will share all the questions which would be collected from the participants to all the speakers, and we would share it with the answers with all the registered participants. So I would like to say that. So great. So one question which I see, I think largely is applicable for all the speakers, and I would like any one of you to pick up, is that what kind of IEC was undertaken for piloting or mainstreaming, scheduled desludging or pilot desludging. So if any one of you would like to pick up IEC in terms of behavioral change or Zore, would you have any experience, or Julia? What is the IEC which was undertaken? Any examples?
Yeah, I think like I mentioned in the presentation, we made the mistake of starting off for the scheduled desludging without really preparing the ground. That was a major mistake. But subsequently, there's been a lot of campaigns over media, over traditional media, that is newspapers, through TV, through radio and social media as well now. And in addition, let's say in a particular area where they want to promote the desludging, then they hold a camp in that area. They come up with an exhibition in that particular area itself, engage with the local leaders, and offer the desludging within, say, a few days, and tell them what are the advantages, what are the, what do you call, pros and cons of desludging. And let people take advantage of that. And one more thing which unique, which is being done in Malaysia, is also the school program. The school program where our communication team from the Water, they go to schools and give talks to students, to children, to what actually is the importance of wastewater in general, and particularly on desludging as well. And these children, is much more easier to reach out to them, and they understand, and they are able to go back to their house and talk to the parents as well. So it's been found to be very effective. Another aspect was also for the sewerage part, where there are open days at the sewage treatment facilities. So when you have a sewage treatment facility, you get the people in that area invited to come and visit the plant and see what actually happens to their waste. It's not so simple, right? So these kind of things have been done and very, very effective in promoting, the importance and getting people to understand. I think it has done a great job that way. Yeah, thank you.
There's one question directed to you directly from Urja Vasist. She wants to know that why the incremental technologies and why trenching in particular was phased out from Malaysia. So if you have, if you can take this here.
Yeah, so when in 1994, when they started the scheduled desludging, there were no facilities. I mean, almost no facilities for treatment. And the company had to carry out the emptying, and the sludge had to go somewhere. So the first thing they did, actually, were two things. One was they found suitable places where, which were far away from habitable areas, and where the groundwater and pollution from the deep row entrenchment would not be detrimental to groundwater and things like that. And they started this trenching. So they just dig a trench and put in the sludge and cover it, right? And the second thing they did was crude co-treatment in existing ponds, particularly oxidation ponds. They dumped sludge in there. And that was soon became a big problem, because the ponds started filling up with sludge, and islands started forming in the ponds. So they had to stop that. And until other facilities like drying beds, like mechanical dewatering combined with co-treatment and so on, until those could be built, the Department of Environment, which are the environmental regulator, they allowed this liquid sludge to be trenched. And once there were sufficient facilities, the Department of Environment stopped that approval, which means they do not allow wet sludge to be trenched. So right now, dried sludge is able to be still trenched, but not wet sludge anymore.
Okay, but at least it was something better than nothing, if I'm not wrong, when we started with it, there was nothing.
To allow until you get something better.
Yeah. So great. I think we had very interesting questions. I would take liberty of being moderator and saying that all the questions will be taken up with the speakers. We'll forward it to them, collect the answers, and share it with all our participants. I also saw that somebody answered the previous question, which Juliet you were not able to take up at this moment, but they say that Bangladesh Agriculture Council gives the permission for the compost. Okay, so that also stands answered here. So looking forward to further sessions. I think let's now go to the next session where we have invited champions on FSM in India who have done some excellent work on pushing this agenda to the next level where effective fecal sludge management across value chain needs to be addressed. And I have Asim Mansoori, Senior Program Lead, Sewage Septage University. He would be taking us through the journey in Maharashtra, 2 towns, how the scheduled desludging has been mainstreamed. Asim?
Thanks, Suresh. Yes, I'll just share my screen. Is my slide visible?
Yes, they are visible. You will control your presentation?
Yes, I control it. Yeah, great. Okay. 1 minute. Okay. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about an experience that we have in Maharashtra about citywide scheduled desludging services. And many of the points that were raised by my former speakers and panelists, we have tried to address them in the model that we have implemented in these 2 towns of Maharashtra, and we'll also be talking about how these activities, which started with 2 cities, are now being scaled up at state level and also at a country level. So just to give you a little context about these 2 cities, that the city of Vai, it's a small town. It's located near Pune on the western side. It's a part of Maharashtra. The population is around 43,000 with around 4% population in slums. This is a very famous town where many of the Bollywood movies have been shot. And it's also a holy town. It's called the Dakshin Kashi of India. The second town that we're going to discuss is Sinnar, which is located near Mumbai, from 200 kilometers from Mumbai. And it's a larger town with 73,000 population. And it's a fast growing town. The reason that why I showed you these slides for Vai and Sinnar on the demographics is that these 2 towns are representative of almost 7,400 towns of India, which include around 3,600 urban local governments, as well as small census towns like 3,800 census towns. And this activity that we have done in these 2 towns are also applicable for many small towns in Southeast Asia as well as Africa. So what we did in these 2 cities, that this citywide inclusive FSSM service delivery began in 2014. The journey started in 2014. Both these cities were declared ODF under the Swachh Bharat Mission of India, and ODF++ more recently in 2018-19. So some of the key highlights, I think, just want to give you a glimpse of the highlights of these 2 cities, is that they did scheduled desludging of septic tanks. They involved private sector for providing this service. They levied a sanitation tax to finance this O&M of the desludging service. They have set up fecal sludge treatment plants to treat all the waste. We were of the opinion that we should treat what we collect. So we first set up the treatment facility and then started scheduled desludging, what I think Juliet had raised the point. Very important, it was funded by the local government owned funds, and even philanthropic funds were used. Very important is that we have set up monitoring systems in these 2 towns to monitor the entire service chain. So it's not only a paper-based monitoring, but also using IoT-based systems and online monitoring systems. There is reuse of treated wastewater. And last but not the least, and very important, that we have a municipal commitment that they will continue with these services beyond the project cycle. So these towns, when we started in 2014, we were calling them the urban laboratories, and they have now moved to like lighthouse cities, which are guiding and informing policies and policymakers and decision makers on how scheduled desludging needs to be done. So as I mentioned before, that these 2 cities, both the cities in 2014, when the government of India Swachh Bharat Mission or the Clean India Mission started, these cities were proactive, and they had started about talking about fecal sludge management much before it came into topic in India. They agreed through an executive order, which we call as a council resolution, to implement citywide FSSM services, involve private sector. do scheduled desludging, levy the sanitation tax, and also allocate land. And this was one of the first cities in India to pass such an executive order at a city level. So what is the difference? So what are we talking about under scheduled desludging service? I think most of the panelists before also talked about that in most of the cities in India or even globally, we have this on-demand service where my septic tank gets full, you raise a complaint with the local government or with the private sector, and they provide you a service against a fee. So generally the households are, this is more household-led, where the households raises the demand for the services. What we have been talking about is scheduled practices. It's like a predetermined schedule, like your SWM door-to-door collection service that comes to your house. It comes daily to your house. Similarly, the scheduled services would come in once in 3 years or 5 years based on the schedule to your house to collect the septage. Awareness generation has been very important. Because of scheduled desludging, we were able to get the required number of trucks to desludge them. This can be by the local government or the private sector, and local taxes were to be levied to finance the operating cost. So what are the benefits? I think to summarize the benefits of scheduled desludging, why we have been arguing about and advocating about this is that it is an equitable and inclusive service. So all the properties in both the cities or wherever we are doing scheduled services, all the properties that have septic tanks are covered. The pricing that is offered is much lower. I remember that the people were paying around 2,000 rupees a septic tank for desludging. Against that, now they're only paying 300 rupees for the scheduled service because of optimization of infrastructure. The route is defined, you know where to go with the trucks, so your costs are lowered. There has been a behavior change. I think in Swachh Bharat Mission, one of the message that we got that people were not using toilets because they were of the feeling that their septic tank would get full and they would have to desludge. Because of regular desludging, there has been a behavior change. People are using toilet more regularly. There is no need for manual labor because, as you all know, we all have been working in this sector, that the septage hardens if you don't desludge at an interval of 8 to 10 years. When it's desludging happen at 8 to 10 years. So because of this hardened sludge, it can't be removed. But when you do regular desludging, you don't require manual labor, but it can be done through mechanized equipments. Very important is infrastructure optimization. I think we have seen that STPs and FSTPs are oversized or underutilized because it was not planned. But when you do schedule, you know the number of septic tanks that you need to desludge and how much load of septage will go to your treatment facility. And very important, there are environmental benefits. We have seen and studied that there are reduction in BOD levels, TSS levels when your septic tanks are desludged on more regular basis. And we'll be talking about that in more detail. So how did this planning happen? So this whole city, this is a map of Y, which is around 5 square kilometers, where it was divided into 3 zones. Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. And we mapped the vulnerable areas also, that which were the areas where it would be difficult for trucks to go, or we would need a longer hose pipe so that it can go into larger distances. We all mapped these activities. We based on the number of septic tanks. So for example, in Y, we had to desludge around 1,000 septic tanks annually. So based on that number of septic tank, the number of trips that a truck can make, we were able to decide on number of trucks that are required. And similarly, we were able to do a route planning for this activity. So in each year, for like in Y and Sinnar, we had a 3-year desludging cycle. So in year 1, Zone 1 is desludged, year 2, Zone 2, year 3, Zone 3. And the cycle repeats itself after 3 years. So this is the way we did in both the cities, Y and Sinnar. And we did this route planning more. So like, for example, this Zone 1, this is a zoomed in version of Zone 1, where we were able to map the whole route of the truck, that this is the way the truck has to go and cover each and every property that has a septic tank, whether it's a slum, non-slum or a commercial property, they were to be covered under this scheduled services. So this is the way we went about of implementing the services in these 2 towns. For providing this service, the local government said that let's involve a private sector and we can be more of guiding them and monitoring them as an activity, but we should involve private sector. So the private sector engagement that was done in these 2 towns, for the first clause that they had added in the contract, and it was a scheduled model contract where the ownership of the assets, so the trucks were to be brought by the private sector for providing these services. During our study with the local governments and the private sector, there were 2 main concerns that were raised. So the private sector said that we were not being paid on time for the schedule, for the services that we are providing. So how do you mitigate it? So the city decided to set up an escrow mechanism, which was like a tripartite agreement between the local government, the bank, and the private sector, where the local government, the city government agreed that we will pay you 3 months, not pay, but we will put in a bank account 3 months of payment that has to be made to you. So for example, if my monthly contract was around 2 lakh rupees, then 6 lakh rupees is always as a minimum balance that is available in this account to pay to the private sector. So that was about redressing the concern of private sector. But the local government also raised a concern that why should we pay if private sector does not perform? So for them, we did this performance linked payment where the track specified a target that annually you have to desludge 3,000 septic tanks. So if you only are able to desludge, let's say 70% of the septic tanks, you're only paid for 70% and not for the 100%. So it was more performance linked payment. And the private sector had to carry out the awareness activities and also provide emergency services. It may happen that there is an emergency request from zone 3. So the private sector was obligated to provide that service under this scheduled desludging contract. And all the households, whether it's a slum, non-slum, that had septic tanks, they were all covered under this contract. So this was the financing model that we used. We call it the performance-linked annuity model, PLAM model, wherein the capital cost and the O&M cost is brought in by the scheduled desludging provider. They provide this service to all the properties. Against this, the properties pay a sanitation tax, which is part of the annual property tax system, to the local government. And the local government transfers the sanitation tax funds into an escrow account with 3 months balance payment. And then based on the performance of the private sector, they pay to the contractor. And this septage, if it is only dislodged at the treatment facility, then only they get paid for that septic tank. So this is the cyclic model that we followed for and closing the whole loop for the providing these scheduled services. And we are very happy to tell all of you that through this model of scheduled services, this is a city of Y, we have been able to cover almost 90% of the septic tanks. You need to realize that this service, the local government provided this as a service, and it was not demand driven. So because it was service led, the people did not have to pay the charge when the desludging service was being provided. We had 90% of the septic tanks were desludged, and the acceptance rate from the households was almost 95%. And we have been able to cover almost desludged 2,000 septic tanks within this city. That was on the operation side, but there were also environmental benefits that we were studying in this, that whether scheduled desludging improves the water quality. And we have observed that because of regular desludging, there was improvement, there was reduction in the BOD levels, the total suspended solids and nitrogen that was coming out of septic tanks, which eventually went inside the river. So there was an overall improvement in the ground and river water quality in this city. And we are writing a paper on this and we'll share with the larger audience about the impacts on scheduled desludging on ground and river water. To finance this, I think financing is a very important thing. Infrastructure can be there, but how do you finance so that it's more sustainable? The local governments levied sanitation tax, as I mentioned before, as a part of the property tax. And I think Juliet mentioned or Doraiji mentioned that it should be differential tax. So based on if your property has a toilet, does not have a toilet, a tax is levied. And this tax is much lower than what the households were paying for the distress call, the charge that they were paying, like 2,000 rupees, 3,000 rupees for septic tank desludging, because that was a distress call and people were ready to pay any amount. Against that, it's much lower amount that the households pay right now, and because of which we have a high acceptance rate in this city. Now, the idea that the city is now looking forward is to make it more equitable. They are planning to levy it as a percentage of property tax. So if you have a bigger property, you pay more tax. If you have a smaller property or you are from a vulnerable population, you pay lower tax based on your size of property. So the city is now moving towards percentage-based property tax system. Now, to collect everything and to treat is very important. So both the cities, Y and Sinnar, they have set up these fecal sludge treatment plants, which have solar panels. So they are now energy neutral. They are generating more solar and they are putting it on-grid system. And to reuse for around 70,000 liters of, around 50,000, 70,000 liters of septage that comes, They have been reusing it for creating urban forest and landscaping. And also they have engaged with self-help women group to generate employment and getting them on board for the O&M of this maintenance of these beautiful landscape areas and gardens in both these cities. So this is a very innovative thing that these two cities have done about reuse as well as setting up solar panels for mitigating the electricity cost. I think there were questions in the panels that what about awareness? I think it was one of the key features for our success model in both these cities, where the private sector visited each and every household to inform them about the scheduled services, along with this leaflet that why you need to desludge, what are the checks you need to do that when the private sector provides this service. It was told that nobody should enter the septic tank. So it was mentioned here that you should not allow any person to enter inside the septic tank. Similarly, paintings were done across the cities, WhatsApp message, social media was used. And also very important, we used to send SMSs 2 days before their turn. So their households were also informed about their turn on SMS-based system as well as through in-person visit. To monitor all these services across the service chain from conveyance as well as treatment, we have set up systems like Sanitap, Sanitrack. So Sanitap captures the on-site system, the actual information of septic tanks. And we think that it's one of the first kind of database that we have on actual septic tank database based on the desludging service that is provided. This Sanitrack system is more like the Amazon service delivery app, which has a digital signature. So if your household has been provided this service, you sign on this app and this same form goes to the treatment service provider and they have to sign against this signature that they have received a septage. Sorry. So and this way we are closing the loop that whatever septage is collected, it goes to the treatment facility and there is geo-stamping and signatures that happen. And the SaniQ thing we have set up at the fecal sludge treatment plants, which monitors the effluent quality coming out of the treatment facility at a periodic intervals. So based on the outlet levels, BOD, COD, TSS, we are able to guide the FSTP operation in these cities. And all this is monitored through a dashboard, which is monitored by the local governments as well as the private sector. So what has the success been? What have we achieved in these cities? That both the cities, we have been able to desludge around 4,200 plus septic tanks. Previously, this number was only 400 for both the cities. Against that, we are now able to desludge 4,200 septic tanks, covering 7,000 plus properties. One round of scheduled desludging is covered. Vulnerable properties that we are mapping, the slum households, the slum-like households, they are also being provided this service at this lower cost. Almost 28 million liters of septage has been treated, which is a huge amount for such small size cities, but we have been able to treat that and reuse it as well. 95% acceptance rate for scheduled services, and now households are paying only the sanitation tax and they are not paying the user charges and paying the less amount of sanitation tax, and we have seen overall improvement in the water quality. And both the cities have now been, yes, yeah. And both the cities have now been declared ODF++ by MoHUA. So we, as an organization and while working with the cities, we always felt that it's not about doing the 2 pilots, but how do you scale this up? And we, Center for Water and Sanitation, work with Government of Maharashtra for statewide scale up on FSM. And the learning of these 2 cities have informed policies and guidelines at state level. Similarly, they have influenced policies at national level. The new Swachh Bharat Mission guidelines or even the Swachh Sarvekshan now talks about scheduled services. To replicate, we need tools. We can't be everywhere. So how do you replicate it? So we have set up tools, Sanitap, Sanitrack, PSP toolkits on how to engage FSM for how to engage with for scheduled services. And we have also model tenders on scheduled desludging service and SOPs so that it can be replicated in other parts of India and even globally. And this has been disseminated widely with various stakeholders. To attain all this, it's important to recognize and acknowledge the partnerships that we had with the funders like BMGF and HSBC, the very important government partners, the Y local government, the government of Maharashtra and the Sindhu Nagar Parishad. And to scale up these learnings at national level through the alliance, the National Fecal Sludge and Septage Management Alliance, we have been able to scale up these learnings at national level. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. And if you want to read more about our work, about the scheduled services, or even apart from this, what the center does, you can visit our website, pass.org.in, or you can write to us on this email ID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asim. Very interesting case study. I think this shows the confidence that we can do these things. But however, yes, the question remains is that there are some costs which are borne by a variety of sector players. But how much does it cost for a city if they have to do on its own? That would be one of the interesting things to see, that how do we scale up if cities have to do it on their own. Very interesting presentation, Asim. So now I would request my colleague to share the details about the next speaker, and I can invite. So now we have a joint presentation by Neladri Chakravarti and Rajesh Ramamurthy. Both are specialists who work with Tamil Nadu Urban Sanitation Support Program. And to you, Neladri and Rajesh, and both of you within yourself will decide that 15 minutes, how will you manage this, okay? Looking forward to hearing the journey of TNUSSP on desludging.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh. Hello, everyone. First of all, thanks to CSC for organizing such a useful webinar and giving us an opportunity to share our learnings from Tamil Nadu. So I'll take a couple of minutes to set the context, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Rajesh, who will take you to different desludging approach in Tamil Nadu. So next slide, Rajesh. Rajesh, next slide. Yeah. So Tamil Nadu is one of the highly urbanized state. As per census 2011, around 48.5% population resides in the urban. And if you see the number of urban local bodies is around 664, where majority is the small towns, the town panchayats. As far as sanitation is concerned, the latest NSSO report suggests that there's a prevalence of septic tank. 67% households relying on the septic tank. So here, next slide, please. I would also like to share the Tamil Nadu Urban Sanitation Support Program, which we are implementing and supporting government of Tamil Nadu in reforming the urban sanitation. So here, government is now in a process of scaling up the affordable FSM solutions, and there is a state investment plan through which they want to scale up the treatment across the state, covering all 664 urban local bodies and around 25 million population, and that's through not only through FSTP but also to endorsing coast treatment. And to sustain this entire FSM thing, equally importance was given on enabling government institutional framework, followed by engagement of private sectors, then capacity building, communication played a crucial role, and also FSM agenda is now no longer just restricted with the municipal and water supply department. It goes beyond that thing, and it's becoming more intrusive. So it is with the school and other departments we are reaching out. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here I would love to share the existing desludging approach in Tamil Nadu. Basically, if we look at the supply and demand side, Tamil Nadu, mostly the business ecosystem is like that. It's predominantly governed by the private sector players in the desludging business. And they are not very much formal. In many cases, it's a family business. And other than bigger city, they are not licensed also. ULBs are having trucks, cesspool trucks. Maybe numbers is also not adequate, and I would not say it's very citizen centric. Many times demand is, even if there is demand, they can't allocate the truck on time. So that problem is there. So predominantly it's a private sector. If you look at the user side, so it's on demand, I mean, having larger size of septic tank is very common. Eventually that doesn't require desludging periodically, which people don't do within 2 or 3 years. As far as cost is concerned, because as I told you, it's a mostly private sector govern, and ample of desludging operators are there. So in bigger city, costs are more or less reasonable, except smaller city where the number of desludging operators are less, but cost is not a problem as such. Next slide, please. Yeah, so with this backdrop, when we started working on this desludging framework, our key consideration was, one is to provide the treatment facility, and that too within, so that the trucks need not to travel far, and which is in one or other to encourage more or more safe disposal, and not to disrupt the existing market. That was a key thing which we felt the government of Tamil Nadu, because it's a thriving business by the private sector, so market should not be, even if it's a regulation, it has to be soft touched, but the market should not be as. But along with that, that occupational health safety was continuously endorsed for the sanitation workers that were engaged in this desludging business. And of course, no cookie cutter approach was adopted, different based on the categories and generators, different desludging approach was tried out. So I'll be stopping here and I'll be handing over it to my colleague Rajesh, who will be taking you through different approaches which we tried out in Tamil Nadu. Rajesh, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Niladri. So I just want to take a moment to switch back to the investment plan that Niladri just talked about, and just walk everyone through the approach. So where we started as a program and working with the government is figuring out that it's important to put treatment facilities, because that's a key consideration for desludging operators. If there's no facility that's within a reasonable travel distance, automatically their costs go up and their incentives to dispose safely reduces. So one of the first things we did is try to map the whole state and try to cluster them based on a radius of 10 to 12 kilometers. So basically, if you have a treatment facility in one town, it could cater to nearby areas within a 10 to 12 kilometer radius. And through that, we were being able to actually try and almost cover or clear through 75% of the state through a cluster approach. The other thing which we also did is, of course, it's important not only just to have this on paper, is to operationalize such an approach. So for that, an approach, basically an MOU framework was circulated. So basically you have the urban local body that has treatment facility, try and sign up an MOU between them and the other ULBs who are part of the cluster, so that this can form, this is useful and may potentially be useful down the line in case of any issues coming up. Now, based on the investment plan approach, what we intended to do in terms of licensing is interesting, and that's what I'm intending to cover in the next slide. So, as Niladri basically mentioned that we already had a reasonable desludging private market, right? And as we know, if markets are working, it's best to leave them operate and not over-regulate these markets. So our approach, the approach that we adopted is, sort of a light touch approach, where we could make it enable them to continue their business operations and just make what's really required from a regulatory standpoint. So one of the things we did is, if you have clusters, you don't have to go and obtain a license from every ULB within the cluster. You could just go to the one that's having the treatment facility, and that means that that license is valid for the entire cluster. The second thing, which is also there, is how much do you pay and for a license, right? So we also wanted to keep the entry barrier fairly low. So we sort of kept the fee based on previous experiences as low as 1,000 rupees per vehicle per year. Similarly, we also wanted to also keep it fairly low enough for them to dispose. So upon every time a truck is coming and disposing at a treatment facility, you could levy up to 100 rupees per load. So these are the two big cost-related measures that operators generally are looking for. Apart from this, of course, there's a bit of paperwork as usual, which is there, which is around vehicle documents. The other thing I wanted to highlight is a lot of the times what's happening is that in most licensing processes, we feel that only the vehicle gets covered. There's nothing about who's working and who's behind the scenes and who's actually doing the work. Usually licensing applications are put forward by owners. There's very little focus on who's actually doing the work. And we wanted to change that a bit. And we started to also ask them to provide paperwork around who's employed, so they can get covered along with other sanitation workers. So because these are private sanitation workers that are not really formally engaged with the ULB, we thought that the licensing process should also allow for a framework that would allow for them to be included and considered along with other sanitation workers that the urban local body may already have. And that obviously leads to some benefits. The next thing I wanted to talk is, of course, the approach I talked about basically covers the large part of providing services on demand, right? That's good, basically business as usual, just make it a bit better. Obviously, then there are cases of how do you deal with different sites of properties, and one size approach doesn't work for all. So the other thing which we look to do is, of course, try to look at who are bulk generators of fecal waste at the local body level. Now, what's tricky, what's interesting here is a lot of these could be basically your apartments, your commercial establishments, your hotels, hospitals, and these sorts of generators. And what we also observe is many a time they may fall somewhere between, they may not qualify for an STP as per regulations, or they may possibly have an STP but not quite ready to actually run and operate it. So these are the sorts of generators which we wanted. So we've actually started working with the urban local bodies which have treatment facility to actually help them identify these types of generators, try to understand what are the sort of practices they have, and then try to see, can they move towards a periodic schedule of desludging. And wherever it's government or state-run properties, obviously the local body has to provide the service for desludging them. So this is one way of looking at it, and I want to just cover the example of how this is being done. So I just want to take the case of Trichy, which is also a citywide inclusive, which is employing a citywide inclusive framework. So one of the examples I just wanted to take a minute and walk through is basically Trichy has a large number of community and public toilets, which is over 300 of them. And about 50% of them are dependent on-site systems. And over a period of about 6 months, what we tried to do is try to improve the service that's provided in terms of desludging. So some of the ways we looked to do it was to basically identify ones with higher footfall, try and prioritize them, and actually draw up a schedule so that the ULB owned truck can go and execute it. So basically they have 2 trucks that actually follow this schedule. And so we'll basically be able to increase the amount of toilets that actually receive service compared to what it was earlier. And now we're also working towards in terms of, okay, what we learned and how can we institutionalize this and have the ULB continue it and keep it going. Now I covered two examples of approaches. One is on demand, and what do you do with periodic desludging and how do you approach it? The last one, which is becoming increasingly important and some of my fellow panelists have talked about, is how do you make your service affordable enough and accessible enough for low-income households. So we tried to run a pilot again in Trichy by working with community and having community level facilitators who could basically, so we did a trial about 3 months in terms of understanding, okay, if we offer a low-income service to slums, what sort of uptake and what sort of feedback are we getting? And what we realized, it doesn't necessarily translate to increase in demand. yes, those who need the service at that point are able to pick it up, but it doesn't nearly translate. But obviously everyone loves a lower price service, right? Be it any sorts of population and low income settlements. They definitely towards the end of the pilot told us that, we'd love this to keep going. Yes, we know. And so what we learned basically from that experience is that, if we can aggregate community demand, then the market itself may negotiate and will be able to bring down prices, because obviously there is a demand. But that may, again, the important thing to consider is that each town's or city's context may be very different. In the case of Trichy, there was a large operator set. There's about 50 trucks that are available at any point in time for desludging, but that may not be the case for any other smaller towns or cities. So that's where maybe the government needs to set in and provide an affordable service. That's also one of the things that we're considering. Again, all of this, putting this all in my context and getting to my last summary slide, is all these approaches are towards preventing unsafe disposal, right? If you can provide a treatment facility, enable your desludging approaches by working with the market, you can ensure that there's not only utilization of services, but of course, environmental benefits, which my fellow panelists have talked about. You need to use a different approach for different towns and contexts, which I covered, be it on demand, be it periodic, or be it providing services to the urban poor. And this approach, even though I mostly talked about urban, can be easily adapted to the rural context. And that's pretty much all I had. And thank you for your attention. And these are many of our partners, and you can follow us up on our website as well as Facebook and Instagram.
Thank you, Rajesh, for the interesting presentation and new perspective that rural and urban clustering for scheduled desludging or desludging on demand works. Very good insights. And I think in India, we are going to scale up this with the Swachh Bharat Mission Rural also trying to address the same issues at the same level in urban areas. So I would straight away, because I know I'm running a little short of time, I would try to close the webinar maybe 10 minutes past 5. But Debisha, you can continue to take your 15 minutes. So my next speaker is Debisha from CDD. And my colleague Sumita, may I request you to share the details about Debisha? Yeah. Debisha is Associate Project Manager at Consortium of Dissemination of DWAT Society at Bangalore. And she has a rich experience of working on, FSM for over 20 plus cities. So Debisha, 15 minutes to you, and more details about Debisha can be found on the chat box.
Thank you, sir. So, yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, very good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everybody. So I will not spend much time into the introduction. I'll just get straight into the topic. So today I will be just discussing about the experiences that we have gathered as CDD Society over the last 7 years. So we have conducted many surveys as a part of different programs, which included citywide, included sanitation system, sanitation projects, fecal sludge management projects. So as part of such different type of projects, we have covered across the country 200 plus cities. So just to give you an idea, this is the range of places we covered. It's across the country, and you can see that some states were a bit more concentrated effort, and some there were like few towns that we covered. But in all, it's been a lengthy process of over 7 years, and that's how we have collected all our data. So when we talk about desludging truck operations, we understand that there are mainly two types of truck operations, as many of my colleagues also indicated, that one is the government control systems and one is the desludging, the private operations. Within the government control systems, we understand that one is that is government staffed and government run, and the other one is privately staffed. So people who the government has the infrastructure, that is the truck, while they outsource the staffing to the private. And the other one is private desludging truck operations. In our experience, most of the country has private desludging truck operators. And one very interesting thing that we have come across is that mostly these people are not really concentrated in one place. They are just going anywhere where they get paid, and all they are really considering is whether they are getting paid for their services, and they are covering operations as large as 60 kilometers up to 100 kilometers. They are going inter-district, they are going between, sometimes if the states are very small, sometimes they are also like, they don't really are not concerned if they need to sometimes cross the state borders, but mainly they are going inter-district, and rural urban, they are already doing that, most of them. Well, the key concerns that we have come across regularly is that most of them do not have a place to dispose safely. And as a result, they end up disposing it into the open. This is a very important point to consider, is that many a times while conceptualizing FSM, we might err on the side of thinking that the service providers might also be part of the problem. It might appear that, okay, they're disposing into the environment and they are causing a lot of issues maybe, but the issue is that they do not have a place to dispose, and due to lack of alternatives, they are disposing in the open. Even when there are places like existing in treatment infrastructures like sewage treatment plants, even then access to the sewage treatment plants is it's very, very difficult, because they need to do a lot of paperwork. They need to follow a lot of procedures. They need to give a deposit, that is a huge tipping fee, in order to be able to access these treatment plants. And we need to keep in mind that most of these service providers are actually small scale service providers. They would be hardly having 1 or 2 trucks, and that's about it. That's their sole livelihood, most of the cases. Of course, there are a few large players, but those are far in between and are mostly concentrated in the megacities. But in the larger part of the country, we found that mostly these are small time operators, and so they cannot really afford to access those treatment plants that are available, even if they are available, if there is a huge tipping fee. So they definitely need a proper space, a designated space to dispose, whether in terms of a safe trenching site, or a more accessible and procedures that are making the existing STPs more accessible for them, or even designated FSTPs. Ultimately, we need to just see how do we enable these operators to access the treatment facilities, because ultimately we all are looking forward to how do we integrate the conveyance and collection systems with the treatment approach. So these people are the link between ensuring that all the sludge that is generated in the septic tanks and the pits, they finally reach the treatment plant. So their considerations have to be really taken into account when we are talking about how do we really put the systems in place. The next issue that we have found, that there are a lot of systemic barriers that they find. One key barrier that they regularly come across is lack of trust on the authorities. There has been historically there has been the situation that because they do not find places to safely dispose, they end up disposing it in the open. As a result, they are many times fined. And because of this regular fines by the authorities, along with that, as we discussed, that a lot of the government services are also provided by the private operators. They are staffed by these private operators. So there is a delayed payment. So what happens is that because these are small scale players, they cannot really afford those delayed payments. As a result, overall, we find that there is very lack of trust when it comes to the authority. And even when we are trying to get these people organized and trying to get the interviews for a project, it is very difficult. They are hardly willing to even talk. So what we really need to work on is building on this trust, so that how can we ensure that these people start trusting the governments. The next thing is, as many of the previous speakers have indicated, there is a lack of felt need. Desludging is not something people really always look forward to carrying out. They construct, especially in Indian context, we understand that they construct containments like septic tanks or pits that last for generations. So there's hardly any felt need. Only when there is a backflow into the toilet or there's some problem that the desludgings happen. So definitely there is a lack of felt need for the services. And of course, there is an issue with the service quality itself. Is many times there is issue, as I already said, that many times they would be catering to beyond their home areas, like they might be going to up to 60 to 100 kilometers. So there is a chance that there are delays in delivering the services. So there is a lack of punctuality. The hygiene standards are really low. Then there's of course an issue in terms of the public perception and how customers are reacting and how these people are handling the customers. Many times the way they talk and the way many times they interact, there are issues with that as well. So one of the key things that we need to focus is on the mainstreaming of these services and also creating awareness for the need for desludging. So whether we do in terms of the IEC, whether in terms of posters or whether in terms of building the capacities of these people on how do we help them carry out very basic things like the safety of the truck, the safety of their person. How can they follow proper health and hygiene standards? How can they handle the customers? What is the better way to interact with the customers? How can they keep the very basic accounting? So all these things come into place when it comes to addressing these systemic barriers. So then we come to the question of scheduled desludging. The moment we start talking about scheduled desludging, we are invariably talking about necessitating a price fixing and licensing regime. So as we discussed in the previous point, that there is a trust deficit, and plus then the whole price fixing would mean that whatever they are charging right now, they will have to depend on what government is going to pay them. So given this whole thing, how do we address the trust issues? And even from the household sides, because it's not just that desludging operators are going to have a problem. Many times the households themselves might resist because they have constructed, after putting a fortune into construction of the containments, they have put a fortune and they have made sure that it lasts for a very long time. And now we are asking them to desludge every 5 years in many cases in India. So how do we ensure that the households really comply? What is the incentive for the households to comply? And what is the incentive for the desludging operators comply? So in the containment part, there are people who do not want it. In the collection part, there are the desludging operators do not want it. So how do we go about ensuring scheduled desludging? In our experience, the best way to maybe start going about is to rethink about the whole system of scheduled desludging itself. Can we rethink about scheduled desludging that instead of focusing on the households in the first bit itself, can we just focus on the bulk generators? When I'm talking about bulk generators, we are talking about things like large housing complexes, like apartment complexes, large commercial complexes, schools, offices, hospitals, educational institutions. Because in most of the towns, there will be already a pre-existing list and a very defined systems, because most of these places will be also be having a lot of licenses or they are embedded into the system. So what happens is that they are easy to track and it's easier to ensure relatively that if there's a guidance issued, there's compliance. However, if we go about going directly into the household desludging, it might be very much difficult because as many of the speakers indicated, we do not have the database of the households. So it might be easier if we start thinking in terms of the bulk generators, because there is high chances that we have their database already in place. At the same time, if we rethink about licensing, that instead of getting a price fixing model, if we can just think about quality enhancement, because we need to remember, we need to first build the trust. So the licensing is just to give them a recognition that these people are licensed. Maybe in return of the licensing, helping them enhance their quality by giving them adequate training in different aspects that we discussed, whether it's health and hygiene, whether it's accounting, whether it's helping them maintain their whole services. So these are the things we need to talk about when we are talking about licensing. So getting into licensing without getting into price fixing, but focusing on the quality enhancement. So in all, when we are talking about a very incremental approach, that we first start working on the trust issues. and this can be started from the beginning of the project when we are setting up the FSTP, when we are doing the stakeholder consultations, we start right from there, working on the trust issues. Then we get into scheduled desludging only for the bulk generators, and maybe if necessary, even licensing, but without fixing the price. So we have to ensure that how do we get these people into the fold of systems and policies, while these people are actually most of the times very happy to be out of the system. That's what our experience says, because they have this trust deficit. As a result, they don't want to interact too much with the governments. So how do we ensure that they actually opt for licensing regime? They are willing to interact with the government when there is so much of trust issues. So the first step while working on the trust issue, we have to get them into the folds without compromising on their business, whether the extent of their business or the pricing of the business, and also getting the bulk generators into a mode of scheduled desludging. While this can be done, and over a period of time, if we need to focus on improving the quality of service, and finally, if all these things are in place, maybe we can start thinking about if the households are adequately sensitized into the whole need for desludging itself, because scheduled desludging is a second step. But right now we are beginning at a phase where households don't even realize there's a problem with their containments. How do we get the buy-in of the general public for desludging? And maybe later on, if all the scheduled desludging for the bulk generator works well, then maybe we can get the buy-in from the general public and the households for a desludging, and move ahead with the desludging. And a better, because the moment we talk about scheduled desludging for the households, we have to get into price fixing, because we have to take into account the socio-economic inequities in the particular region. So as a result, there will be things of in which we are talking about contracting, in which we are talking about cross-subsidizing, in which the whole interaction with the government will increase. And as a result, we have to focus on the whole building of trust, and then getting these people willing to interact more with the government. So
can you summarize, please?
Sorry?
Can you summarize just 1 minute more, please?
Yeah. I mean, so overall, that's what I would say as my key takeaways, that we once we start working on the trust issues and improving the service quality, we start with the scheduled desludging of the bulk generators, that is the large housing complexes or the institutional containments. And then eventually, when the FSM system is already well established and people are well aware of the need for FSM, then we move into the scheduled desludging for households. So yeah, so I would like to close that we need to start rethinking about how do we go about desludging and scheduled desludging regimes. With this, I'm just coming to the end of our presentation, and yeah, so happy to collaborate on more such ideas. We are CDT Society. We are a not-for-profit based out of Bangalore, India, and we work across the different segments of sanitation, from wastewater, fecal sludge management, water body rejuvenation, and solid waste management. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Devisha, for interesting presentation. And CDT is known for its contributions in this sector for a long time, and we value this contributions in the sector. So may I ask you to stop sharing the screen, and can I have the speakers on board now? And if can I request the speakers to switch on the cameras? And I will also take questions from the Q&A. I plan to have close the session in another 7-8 minutes, certainly by 5:15. So I would take few questions, but first question is also to Asim, which is my question as well as one of the participants' question, is that I was wondering that there was around 42,000 population you said, but you said you are only desludging 2,000 septic tanks. So what is the percentage of the households dependent on septic tanks? And second question is, which is in everybody's mind, but also a participant has asked, is that is 300 rupees sufficient enough to cover the cost of operations, or is it somebody subsidizing, and who is subsidizing?
Great, I think great question. On the first part of your question, I think for the 43,000 population, around 80% is the individual household toilet coverage, with almost everybody having septic tanks. But in Y, what we have, it's a typical scenario. It's more an apartment buildings. So more households are covered through maybe 1 or 2 septic tanks. So when you actually count the absolute number of septic tanks, there are only 3,000, which covers around 8,000 urban households which have toilets and septic tanks. So in a way, it's that ratio. And it's because of the apartment type buildings that we have in Y. Similarly, on the second question, I think there are two things. So that's the where I mentioned about INR 300. It's the sanitation tax that the household pays annually for 3 years. So it's around 900 rupees over 3 years, and they get their septic tank desludged in a way free of cost based on the schedule. That covers the 100% O&M cost of the scheduled services for the case of Simnar. In case of Y, that amount is only 60 rupees because they wanted to incentivize households to desludge. So that's only around 180 rupees over the period of 3 years. But there they're only able to cover around 40% to 50% of the O&M cost. The rest 50% comes from the local government's own funds, the surplus that they have from the property tax systems. So it's subsidized in Y, and it's 100% cost recovery in case of Simnar. I hope that answers both your queries.
Yeah, it does answer. But if there is, Asim, if there are bigger septic tanks, would you still charge 300 rupees? Or if it is being emptied in more number of trips, how does this work? I think this is a question from, I'm forgetting the name. But yes, if you can answer this question, this is for wider audience.
So in case of apartment buildings, let's say there are 20 apartments, everybody is paying 300 rupees there, or 60 rupees for that matter. So in a way, they are already paying. What we have done for the private sector's benefit, because they have to maybe desludge a larger septic tank, do more trips. So we have equated that to number of properties. So for example, if there are let's say 9 apartment properties in 9 flats in apartments, so we equated to a number of 3. So they will be getting paid for 3 septic tanks in a multiple of 3, even though they may desludge 1 or 2 septic tanks, which are much larger and more trips are required. So that's the way they are subsidized. So it's a risk that the private sector also takes and the local government also takes. They may have to pay less also. For example, in household septic tanks, you can desludge 2 septic tanks in a trip, but they are still getting paid for 2 septic tanks. So it's a win-win situation, and the risk that both local government and private sector take under this contract.
Okay, great. So there's a question by Sunil Rathi to Debisha. Are there any interventions that can be done at the household level to improve the overall desludging operations?
Yeah, so for overall desludging operations, I think the first step is just start with the IC campaigns. That's what the first thing needs to be done, because the household needs to start feeling that there is a problem with their containments. So that's they start willing to get into the whole desludging thing. And of course, as we get into eventually when the systems are established and we are talking about scheduled desludging systems for the household at the eventual point of time, we have to think about like considering the socioeconomic brackets and accordingly think about the pricing and then the cross subsidization. Those things have to become.
There's one more question. I think this was based to Debisha, saying that you have talked about your surveys across India. So the participant has not mentioned it. It says DM. So I don't know what does that mean. DM,
direct message, but, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. So no, the name is that DM. So it's the participant says is that many cities in Gujarat, Karnataka, and Maharashtra, most private desludgers have a deal with farmers and they empty their trucks on the farms. I believe it means that agricultural fields. How come you did not find any of these kind of arrangements in your surveys?
No, we actually found so a lot of them. That's what I was saying, that they dispose in the open. So what happens is that one is that when they are disposing in the farmlands, and if they already have a previous arrangement, then it's okay. But the point is, a lot of the times we have also found that they will be disposing in the nalas. They will be disposing into the water bodies. That's where they typically get in the public space, and that's where they typically get fined. So it's not that there is no arrangement for farmlands, but yeah, there is also the situation in which they are talking about like in which they are disposing into the water bodies. Also, we have to take into account that the whole farm demand is very limited to seasons. It's not there all the time. Many a times people will be asking for this water maybe just previous to the monsoon, when there is the agricultural season, when there's a water scarcity. This is the time when people will be asking there. So farmlands are not always available for disposal. When there's crop standing, nobody gives their farmlands for disposal. But desludging can happen all the year, right? It happens all the year.
Illegal. Am I correct? These arrangements were not declared illegal, or there was no penalty on, because these are untreated waste being taken by.
That's the problem. There is no system. These are informal things, and we have to again understand that many of the desludging truck operators, they themselves come from many of the villages, or and they come from different kind of communities. So they might be just having those arrangements. But given that it's a very seasonal demand, but desludging happens all the year long, how much of it will be actually accommodated into the farmlands? That's a very that's one component of it, but yeah, a bulk of it definitely gets into the random places and out in the open.
Thank you, Devisha. I would like now to call upon all the speakers to take 1 minute each, or maybe 30 seconds each, to just 1 minute is fine, I think I've said. So to tell us that, in India, I know 3 examples from India we have presented where there is donor funding and various other players supporting these initiatives on scheduled desludging. I don't know how did it work in international experiences, but if each one of you could tell that what works and what doesn't work, because many cities are looking forward to where there may not be these kind of donors available, or international champions or change, leaders who are supporting these cities. What precautions they should do, or what way they should go? Any suggestions? I would say each one of you can take 1 minute, but or if you want, only few of you want. So can I start, Durai, with you? Durai?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So I think one of the things I covered was that we should not go on a big bang approach. I know that in Sinar and why, in fact, I've been to Sinar with Asim and so on, and that was very good. And I saw that there was a lot of political commitment, by the local political people. And that is what I think made it successful. But in general, you will find that going on a big bang approach is usually won't work, So you might need to go on a systematic one. And some of you may be familiar with Dumaguete in Philippines. I think, Suresh, we have been there ourselves also.
Yes.
So what they started with was a 5-year interval, and starting from what you call a demand desludging, they went on a 5-year interval first, and they showed the results. We saw that waterfront there. The waterfront became cleaner, and everybody was sitting there and having their dinner and enjoying the sea breeze, and they could see that this was helping. And then they went on to increase the frequency and people buy in and so on, So this is what I call the incremental thing, where you show the results and then you start going a little bit bigger, go to the next step.
Very good.
Then people are also willing to pay.
Yeah, got it. Incremental approach. Yeah, very good. So, Juliet, what is your final take? What would you like to recommend in Indian cities like 450 plus going for FSTP operations? Not everywhere we would have Asim and would have Devisha or CDD or Rajesh supporting them.
Yep.
How would you?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say it's about. I still think some of the steps we talked about, you don't need an external party to help collect information about really what the real situation is and to make it more visible. I think, Durai, you mentioned the feedback loop of when things get better, then people will get on board. I think we also need to put the problems right in people's faces at first to get the initial political will to even take the first steps. So to me, the making visible the problem is the first step. And then after that, it's about making sure the solutions are developed in the context by the people who are there, and that you're weighing up the pros and cons, because there's no one single simple solution. There are many choices to be made. I think we've heard through all the different speakers. So solutions that are developed within the city itself. Thank you.
Buddy, would your take on this to other global south countries? Not why just say India, because many other countries would also be looking forward to your experiments or piloting what you've done. So what would be your take, Nepal, Bangladesh, or similar context, other countries here?
Yeah, I think I agree with Professor Juliet that it is depend on the situation of the city itself. But from my experience, I think we have to know exactly how the people react or how the people expect what is the best for them. Sometimes here in Indonesia, we just cannot just give the septic tank free to them because the attitude or the behavior is not there yet.
So I'm aware of that. I'm just touching that 5:15, 5. So I would just take the liberty to say that, if Asim, if you can give the last word from the Indian presenter side, what would be the suggestion with the most successful case study? But that will allow me to close it in 1 or 2 minutes, if you can. And other speakers will allow me, the Indian presenters, to. Asim is a big champion for this. Yeah, please, Asim.
Thanks, Suresh. So I think to make these things work, whether you go for schedule or not, but to make schedule desludging work, I think most important is to strengthen the local governments themselves. So it's not about an external party going there and doing it, and then maybe if you move out, it will all fall down. So how do you strengthen the local government to do this? Like we did in these 2 cities, we engaged with the local government, they floated the tender, they engaged with private sector. And how do you strengthen them to do that activity would be very important to make this work. Second thing is financing. How do you finance it through the local governments? You can't have philanthropies or donors everywhere. It has to be funded from the local governments. How do you strengthen that would be very important to look at for strengthening this. Are the 2 suggestions that I have to make this work. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Asim, and very interesting. I learned a lot in today's session. I would say thank you very much to all participants as well as the speakers who have shared their experiences. And I think what I want to say is it was not overnight these things happened. Many of you have worked for over 6-7 years. I see the case studies clearly told us that. And, Dorai's experience from Malaysia, where he has covered a vast journey of 2 or 3 decades, how things have moved on from, very basics to very sophisticated systems of desludging also. So good, thank you very much. I would like to thank all the participants, all the speakers for sharing their experience. All my colleagues who have put this webinar together. At one point of time, I saw that there were around 350 plus participants connecting from different parts of the world. Thank you very much for sparing time and joining us. And I think this event was also live streamed. We would come back to you, this group, and all the participants with the statistics, how many people were watching you and listening you. And these videos will be made available on YouTube and Facebook Live because this was recorded. We will share the presentations with all the participants who have registered, PDF copies as indicated. If any of the speakers does not want or has any restriction, please let us know. So I take this opportunity to thank my colleagues Sumita, Singal, and Jyoti and Sukanya, who have worked in a very short time frame to put this together. Thank you very much to all of you. And I would say goodbye, good evening, and good night to all of you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Suresh. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, people.
Yeah, thank you.